The summer sun beat down on the wide fields of the Morgan farm, turning the wheat golden and the workers' shirts dark with sweat. Old Thomas Morgan stood on the porch of his farmhouse, looking out over the land his family had owned for 3 generations. At 65, his back ached more than he liked to admit, and the thought of managing all 500 acres was becoming too much to bear. Thomas wiped his weathered brow with a handkerchief and sighed. The time had come to divide the farm among his 3 sons. He'd been putting it off for years, but his doctor's warning about his heart last month had finally pushed him to make the decision. "Boys," he called out, his voice still strong despite his age, "come up to the house. We need to talk." His sons dropped what they were doing and headed toward the farmhouse. Thomas watched them approach, sizing them up as he always did. James, the oldest at 32, walked with confidence, his stride matching the sure way he handled the farm equipment and workers. Robert, the middle son at 28, moved with less certainty but had a keen mind for numbers and marketing. Then there was Daniel, just 23, still finding his way in the world, always with his nose in a book about new farming methods that Thomas thought were a waste of time. The 3 brothers climbed the porch steps and followed their father inside to the dining room, where a large map of the Morgan property lay spread across the oak table. "Sit down," Thomas said, pointing to the chairs. "I've made a decision about the farm." The brothers exchanged glances. They'd been waiting for this day, knowing their father couldn't manage everything forever. "I'm dividing the property among the 3 of you," Thomas announced, his finger tracing the boundaries on the map. "James, as the oldest, you'll get the Eastern Valley, 200 acres of the best cropland with the irrigation system your grandfather put in. The corn and wheat fields there bring in the most money, and the soil so rich you could drop a nail in it and grow a fence post." James nodded, unable to hide his smile. The Eastern Valley was the jewel of the Morgan farm. "Robert," Thomas continued, "you'll get the western pastures, 150 acres with the cattle herd and the new barn we built last year. The grazing land is top-notch, and with the deals you've been making with the meat processors, you should do well." Robert straightened in his chair. "Thank you, Pa. I won't let you down." Thomas nodded and then turned to his youngest son. "Daniel," he said, his voice noticeably cooler, "you'll get the North Hill section, 100 acres. Daniel's face fell. Everyone knew what land lay to the north, a rocky hillside that had never been properly farmed. It was steep, filled with stones, and the soil was poor. The family had used it for nothing but occasional goat grazing for as long as anyone could remember. That's the hill plot," Daniel said quietly, looking at the map where his father's finger rested. "It is," Thomas replied, crossing his arms. "It's still Morgan land, and it's yours to do with as you please." James and Robert glanced at each other, then looked away, uncomfortable with the obvious unfairness but unwilling to challenge their father. "Why?" Daniel asked, meeting his father's gaze. "Why am I getting the worst part of the farm?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Because your brothers have proven themselves. James has been running the East Fields for 5 years now, and the yields have never been better. Robert has doubled our cattle profits since he took over that side of the business." He leaned forward. "And what have you done, Daniel? Tried those fancy new techniques that wasted time and money. Talked about organic farming and specialty crops when good old wheat and corn have fed this family for generations." The room fell silent. Daniel looked down at his hands, rough from farm work but not as calloused as his brothers. "You need to earn your place," Thomas continued, his voice softening slightly. "Maybe this land will teach you to be practical instead of having your head in the clouds all the time." Daniel wanted to argue, to remind his father about the small test plot of heritage tomatoes that had sold for premium prices at the farmer's market last summer, or how his cover crop experiment had improved the soil in the south field. But he knew it wouldn't change anything. His father had made up his mind. "When does this happen?" Daniel asked instead. "Right away," Thomas said. "I'll stay in the main house, but each of you will be responsible for your own section starting next week. The equipment will be shared, but profits stay with whoever earns them." James clapped his hands together. "This is great news, Pa. I've got plans for the eastern fields that will make you proud." "And I've been wanting to expand the herd," Robert added. "There's a new breeding line I've had my eye on." Thomas smiled at his older sons, then looked at Daniel. "Well, nothing to say." Daniel stood up slowly. "Thank you for the land, Pa. I'll do my best with it." Thomas snorted. Well, at least you're taking it like a man. The meeting broke up shortly after that. James and Robert headed to town to celebrate at the local bar, inviting Daniel to join them. He declined, saying he had work to finish. Instead, he walked up to the North Hill, climbing the steep path that wound through the scrubby grass and rocky outcrops. From the top, he could see the entire Morgan farm spread out below him, the lush eastern valley that would be James's, the green pastures for Robert's cattle, and the sprawling farmhouse where they'd all grown up. The land around him was quiet, unwanted, the black sheep of the Morgan property. Daniel picked up a handful of the rocky soil, letting it run through his fingers. His father was right about one thing. It wasn't good for traditional crops. But as he stood there, feeling the warm evening breeze that seemed stronger on the hillside than down in the valley, an idea began to form. The next morning, when the family gathered for breakfast, Mrs. Hill, their housekeeper who had helped raise the boys after their mother died, sensed the tension immediately. "What's going on with you all?" she asked, placing a platter of bacon on the table. "Pa's divided up the farm," James explained, helping himself to a generous portion. "I'm getting the Eastern Valley." "And I'm getting the western pastures and the cattle," Robert added. Mrs. Hill nodded, then looked at Daniel. "And you, dear?" "The North Hill," Daniel said quietly. Mrs. Hill's hands froze in the act of pouring coffee. "The rocky hillside? But that's—" She stopped herself, glancing at Thomas. "It's what he's earned," Thomas said firmly, cutting into his eggs. "Maybe having his own land, even if it's not the best, will teach him responsibility." Mrs. Hill's lips thinned, but she said nothing more. She'd been with the family long enough to know when Thomas Morgan's mind was set. After breakfast, Daniel headed back to the hillside with a notebook and pencil. He spent the day walking the land, taking notes on soil conditions, sunny spots, and areas where water naturally collected. By evening, his boots were covered in dust, but his notebook was filled with observations and ideas. Over the next few days, while his brothers excitedly planned for their prime farmland, Daniel visited the county library and the agricultural extension office. He returned with books and pamphlets on hillside farming, terracing, and crops that could thrive in rocky conditions. Thomas watched his youngest son's efforts with skepticism. "You're wasting your time with all that reading," he commented one evening as Daniel pored over a book about Mediterranean farming techniques. "No fancy ideas are going to change the fact that hills mostly rock." "Maybe," Daniel replied, not looking up. "But it's my rock now." A week after Thomas's announcement, the division became official. The lawyer came out from town, papers were signed, and each son took possession of their portion of the Morgan farm. James and Robert quickly set up in the two smaller houses that already existed on their properties. But Daniel would need to build something on his hillside. For now, he moved into the old hunting cabin at the base of the hill, little more than a one-room shack with a wood stove and a cot. The first night, as rain drummed on the metal roof and leaked through in 3 different places, Daniel wondered if his father had been right all along. Maybe he was a dreamer. Maybe the hillside would never be anything but a rocky, worthless plot. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. Daniel was marking out areas for his first terracing experiment when an old pickup truck rumbled up the dirt road. To his surprise, Mrs. Hill climbed out, followed by Pete Wilson, the farm's longest-serving hand. "What are you two doing here?" Daniel asked, wiping dirt from his hands. "Came to help," Pete said simply, unloading shovels and picks from the truck bed. "Your father may not see what this land could be, but I've been farming in this county for 40 years. Soil's not as bad as it looks, just needs the right approach." Mrs. Hill nodded, unpacking a basket of food. "And someone needs to feed you while you work. You're too skinny as it is." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "I can't pay you," he admitted. "Not yet, anyway," Pete shrugged. "Don't need paying. Your mother was good to me when times were hard. Besides," he added with a wink, "I've always wanted to see someone prove the old man wrong." As they ate lunch together, sitting on rocks and looking out over the valley below, Daniel shared his plans for terracing the hillside and planting crops that could thrive in the unique conditions. "It won't be easy," he admitted, "but I think it could work." Pete nodded thoughtfully. "It's not what your father would do," he said, "but maybe that's a good thing. Times are changing in farming. Might be this worthless hillside is exactly what you need to try something new." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rocky ground. Daniel felt a spark of hope. The land might be challenging, but it was his challenge now, and for the first time in years he didn't feel the weight of his father's disapproval pressing down on him. "Tomorrow," he said, looking at the hill with new determination, "we start turning this rock pile into a farm." The early morning fog clung to the hillside as Daniel drove the old tractor up the makeshift path he'd cleared the week before. The machine groaned in protest at the steep climb, its engine straining against gravity. When he reached the first terrace he'd marked out, the tractor's front wheels lifted slightly off the ground as he tried to level the soil, sending his heart racing. "Easy," he muttered, easing off the throttle. "Just take it slow." 2 weeks had passed since the land division, and Daniel was discovering just how difficult farming the hillside would be. Every day brought new challenges. The rocky soil broke his plow twice. The steep angle made using machinery dangerous. And when he tried to dig post holes for fencing, he hit stone after just a few inches. By mid-morning, sweat soaked through Daniel's shirt despite the cool spring air. He climbed down from the tractor and kicked at the ground in frustration. A cloud of dust rose up, and underneath more rocks gleamed in the sunlight. It seemed like for every stone he removed, 2 more appeared. "Land's fighting you, ain't it?" Daniel turned to see Pete coming up the hill carrying tools and a water jug. "It's worse than I thought," Daniel admitted, taking a long drink from the offered water. "I've been trying to clear this section for 3 days, and I've barely made a dent." Pete nodded sympathetically. "Your grandpa used to say this hill was where the devil emptied his pockets of rocks." He looked out over the valley below. "Meanwhile, your brother's got land that practically farms itself." As if to emphasize the point, they could see James's tractor in the distance, moving smoothly across the eastern fields, already green with early crops. Beyond that, Robert's cattle grazed contentedly on lush pasture. "Pa came by yesterday," Daniel said quietly. "Watched me for a while, then left without saying a word. But I could tell what he was thinking. And what's that? That he was right. That I'm wasting my time up here." Pete spat on the ground. "Maybe so. Or maybe you just need a different approach." He picked up a rock the size of his fist. "Your pa and your brothers, they farm the way your grandpa did and his pa before him. Nothing wrong with that on flat rock-free land. But this?" He gestured around them. "This needs something different." Daniel nodded, but the weight of doubt pressed heavily on his shoulders. That evening, he sat at his small table in the cabin eating Mrs. Hill's leftover stew and looking over his dwindling savings. The terracing project was costing more than he'd anticipated, and he had nothing to show for it yet. No crops in the ground, no income on the horizon. A knock on the door startled him. When he opened it, he found Robert standing there holding a 6-pack of beer. "Thought you might need this," his brother said with a smile. "Mind if I come in?" Daniel stepped aside, surprised by the visit. Robert looked around the small cabin with raised eyebrows. "Cozy," he commented, handing Daniel a beer. "It's temporary," Daniel replied, though he wasn't sure if that was true. At the rate things were going, he might never afford to build a proper house. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking their beers. "So," Robert finally said, "how's it going up here?" Daniel considered lying, saying everything was fine, but what was the point? His brother could see the truth for himself. "Terrible," he admitted. "The land's mostly rock. The terracing is taking forever. And I'm nearly out of money." Robert nodded slowly. "James and I were talking. We could help you out. Maybe buy your section, give you enough to start fresh somewhere else." Daniel stared at his brother. "You want to buy me out? After just 2 weeks? Be practical, Danny. That hillside's never going to produce like our land. Pa knew it when he gave it to you. Everyone knows it." Robert leaned forward. "Think about it. No shame in admitting when you're beaten." After Robert left, Daniel couldn't sleep. His brother's words echoed in his head. Was he being stubborn, refusing to see reality? Was he wasting what little money he had on an impossible dream? The next morning, Daniel drove into town to visit the bank. He'd hoped to secure a small loan to keep him going until he could get some crops in, but the meeting went exactly as he'd feared. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morgan," the loan officer said, closing Daniel's file, "but the bank can't approve a loan with that land as collateral. It's simply not valuable enough." "But I have plans for it," Daniel insisted, pulling out his notebook. "If I can just get the terracing done and the first crop in—" The loan officer raised his hand, stopping him. "The hill has never produced anything in the county's history." Your father tried once years ago and gave up. What makes you think you'll succeed where he failed?" Daniel had no answer. He left the bank feeling defeated, his last hope slipping away. On his way back to the farm, he stopped at the general store for supplies. As he waited at the counter, he overheard two older farmers talking. "Heard Thomas Morgan gave that rocky hillside to his youngest," one said, shaking his head. "Poor kid. Thomas always was harder on that boy," the other replied. "Never understood why." "Well, the older ones take after him, traditional by-the-book farmers. The youngest has his mother's way of thinking, always looking for a new angle." Daniel loaded his meager purchases into his truck, their words stinging but also stirring something inside him. His mother had been different, creative, willing to try new things. She'd started the vegetable garden that eventually became one of the farm's steady income sources, though his father rarely acknowledged it. Back at the hillside, Daniel found an unexpected visitor waiting for him. Mrs. Hill sat on a large rock, a picnic basket beside her. "I brought lunch," she said simply, "and something else you might need." She handed him a small leather-bound book. Daniel opened it to find his mother's handwriting filling the pages, notes on planting schedules, soil amendments, and garden plans. "Your mother's garden journal," Mrs. Hill explained. She wrote everything down, what worked, what didn't. "There's a section in there about growing in poor soil that might help you." Daniel flipped through the pages until he found it. Detailed notes about plants that thrived in rocky, alkaline soil. Plants he'd never considered growing. She always said farming wasn't just about fighting the land, Mrs. Hill continued. It was about finding what the land wanted to grow. That night, Daniel read his mother's journal from cover to cover. The next morning, he walked his property again, but this time, instead of seeing obstacles, he tried to see possibilities. The rocky soil that refused to grow corn might be perfect for something else. The steep slopes that made traditional plowing impossible could be an advantage for the right crop. A month into his new life as a hillside farmer, Daniel attended the monthly farm community dinner at the town hall. He sat at the back, tired and dusty from another long day of work. His brothers, by contrast, sat near the front with their father, looking prosperous and confident. "And how are things going for you, Daniel?" asked Mrs. Parker, the nosy postmistress who never missed a chance to collect gossip. Aware that several people had turned to listen, including his father down the table, Daniel paused before answering. "Challenging," he said finally, "but I'm learning a lot." "I drove by your place yesterday," said old Mr. Johnson, a retired farmer. "Looks like you're setting up terraces." "Smart move on that slope," Thomas Morgan snorted. "Waste of time and money. That hill's never been worth farming." The table fell silent. Daniel felt his face grow hot. "Maybe it just needs the right farmer," Mr. Johnson replied mildly, nodding at Daniel. "Your boy here is trying something different. Might surprise us all." Daniel met his father's skeptical gaze briefly before looking away. He didn't have the energy for another argument. Later, as people were leaving, Mr. Johnson approached Daniel in the parking lot. "I meant what I said in there," the old farmer told him. "I've been watching what you're doing. It's not the way things have always been done around here, but that doesn't mean it's wrong." He handed Daniel a business card. "My nephew works for the Agricultural Extension Office at the State University. Give him a call. He might have some ideas for your land." That night, as rain pounded on the cabin roof, which no longer leaked thanks to Daniel's repairs, he made a decision. He would give himself 6 months. 6 months to either make the hillside work or admit defeat. The next morning, with renewed determination, Daniel called the number on Mr. Johnson's card. The agricultural extension agent agreed to visit the following week. "I won't give up yet," Daniel told Pete when the older man arrived to help with the day's work. "Not when I've barely begun." Pete nodded approvingly. "Your mother would say the same thing. Stubbornness runs in the Morgan blood, but so does ingenuity. You got both." As they worked side by side, clearing rocks for the next terrace, Daniel noticed something he hadn't seen before. In one section where he'd cleared the larger stones, small green shoots were pushing through the soil, wild herbs growing naturally in the rocky ground. He knelt down, examining the plants more closely, remembering a section from his mother's journal about herbs that thrived in poor soil and commanded premium prices at farmers' markets. For the first time in weeks, Daniel smiled. Maybe, just maybe, the worst land on the Morgan farm had potential after all. Not for traditional crops, but for something his father had never considered worth growing. The agricultural extension agent, a young man named Todd Wilson, stepped out of his truck and whistled as he looked up at the hillside. "Well, you've certainly picked yourself a challenge." "Mr. Morgan," he said, shaking Daniel's hand. "Call me Daniel." "And yes, it wasn't exactly my first choice of land," Daniel replied, leading the way up the rough path he'd been improving. Todd followed, clipboard in hand, occasionally stopping to examine the soil or jot down notes. When they reached the partially completed terraces, he nodded appreciatively. "Good work with these. Most people wouldn't have thought to terrace right away." Daniel shrugged. "Seemed like the only way to create flat ground for planting." They spent the morning walking the property, with Todd asking questions and taking soil samples. By lunchtime, they sat in the shade of a lone oak tree near the top of the hill, looking out over the valley below. "So, what do you think?" Daniel asked, unable to hide the hope in his voice. "Can anything good grow up here?" Todd took a long drink from his water bottle before answering. "The soil's not great for traditional crops, that's for sure. Low nutrients, too many rocks, high alkaline content." He paused, looking around. "But that doesn't mean it's worthless." Daniel leaned forward. "What could work here? Have you considered grapes?" "Grapes, like for wine?" Todd nodded. "Vineyards often thrive in poor, rocky soil. In fact, many of the world's best wines come from regions with terrain similar to this. The stress forces the vines to develop deep root systems, which can actually improve the flavor of the grapes." Daniel frowned. "But don't vineyards take years to establish?" "I don't have that kind of time." "True. A full-scale commercial vineyard takes at least 3 years before your first real harvest. But there are quicker options too. Table grapes can produce faster, and while you're waiting, you could grow complementary crops between the vine rows." He handed Daniel a folder. "Here's some information on hillside vineyards, including contact details for a few vineyard owners in the next county who farm similar terrain. They might be willing to show you their operations." That evening, Daniel pored over the materials, his excitement growing. The folder contained case studies of successful hillside vineyards, including before and after photos that gave him hope. One study particularly caught his attention: a rocky slope in Italy that had been transformed into a productive vineyard using ancient terracing techniques. The next day, Daniel called one of the vineyard owners Todd had recommended, an elderly man named Giuseppe Rossi, who had emigrated from Italy decades ago and established a small but successful winery on terrain that everyone else had considered worthless. "You want to see my vineyard?" Giuseppe asked when Daniel explained the situation. "Come tomorrow. I show you everything." Giuseppe's vineyard was a revelation. Neat rows of grapevines cascaded down terraced hillsides that looked remarkably similar to Daniel's land. Small olive trees and herb gardens filled the spaces between some rows, creating a diverse patchwork of plants. "Beautiful, yes?" Giuseppe said, noticing Daniel's awe. "But you should have seen it 30 years ago. Nothing but rocks and weeds." As they walked through the vineyard, Giuseppe explained his approach. "The key is to work with the land, not against it. Rocky soil, good for drainage. Steep slope, good for air circulation and preventing frost. What looks like problems are actually benefits for the right plants." He showed Daniel his water management system, a series of channels and small reservoirs that captured rainwater at the top of the hill and distributed it down through the terraces. "In drought, my vines still drink while the valley farms struggle," he said proudly. "The height is your advantage. Water flows down, so catch it at the top." By the end of the visit, Daniel's mind was racing with ideas. Giuseppe had given him cuttings from several grape varieties that did well in poor soil, along with a promise to help him get started. "Most important," Giuseppe said as Daniel was leaving, "is patience and hard work. The land will test you before it rewards you." Armed with new knowledge and a clear plan, Daniel threw himself into transforming his hillside. The work was backbreaking. Each terrace had to be carefully constructed to prevent erosion while creating level planting areas. The rocky soil had to be enriched with organic matter that Daniel collected from the nearby woods: fallen leaves, composted vegetation, even the manure from wild deer. Pete continued to help when he could, and occasionally other farmhands would stop by on their days off, curious about what Daniel was doing. Some laughed at the idea of a vineyard, but others offered to help move rocks or dig irrigation channels. "You're crazy, you know that?" said Ben, one of the younger farmhands, as he helped Daniel position stones for a retaining wall. but the good kind of crazy, the kind that might just work. 3 months after receiving his inheritance, Daniel completed his water collection system, a series of gutters and barrels at the top of the hill that captured rainwater and fed it into pipes running down to each terrace. The system was crude but effective, storing thousands of gallons from each rainfall. "Smart setup," Pete commented, inspecting the collection barrels. "Your brothers might laugh now, but wait till the dry season hits." As if on cue, the rain stopped in late June, and the county entered a drought that would stretch through July and into August. The creek that fed the irrigation system in the eastern valley slowed to a trickle, forcing James to ration water for his crops. In the western pastures, the grass began to yellow, and Robert had to supplement his cattle's diet with expensive hay. Meanwhile, on the hillside, Daniel's water collection system provided enough moisture to keep his newly planted grape cuttings alive. It wasn't abundant, but it was sufficient, and the young vines seemed to thrive in the challenging conditions, just as Giuseppe had predicted. When Thomas came to inspect his youngest son's progress after 3 months, his expression remained skeptical, but he stayed longer than before, asking questions about the terracing and water system. "Grapes, huh?" he finally said. "Never would have thought of that." It wasn't exactly approval, but it wasn't dismissal either, and Daniel counted it as progress. The real test came in mid-August when the drought reached its peak. Water restrictions were imposed throughout the county, and farmers watched helplessly as their crops withered in the fields. James had to let portions of his corn crop die to save the rest, and Robert moved his cattle to rented pasture 20 miles away where the grass was still green. On the hillside, Daniel's water reserves were running low, but his plants were surviving. The grapevines, now firmly established, sent their roots deep into the rocky soil in search of moisture. The herbs he'd planted between the rows, thyme, rosemary, lavender, actually seemed to prefer the dry conditions. "You picked the right crops for this weather," Todd said during a follow-up visit. "These Mediterranean plants evolved in dry, rocky regions. They're right at home here." Daniel nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "But I'm still a long way from making any money." "True, but you've accomplished something impressive here." Todd gestured to the terraced hillside with its neat rows of plants. 4 months ago, this was just a rocky slope. Now look at it. Daniel had to admit the transformation was remarkable. The hillside was still far from the lush productivity of his brother's lands, but it was no longer the wasteland everyone had written off. The terraces created a stepped pattern visible from the valley below, and the young plants added patches of green to the formerly barren landscape. Word about Daniel's vineyard project began to spread. Occasionally, cars would slow on the county road below, drivers craning their necks to see what was happening on the hillside. A few local farmers even stopped by to inspect his water collection system, intrigued by its effectiveness during the drought. "You might be onto something, boy," said Mr. Johnson when he visited. "This county's seen 3 major droughts in the last decade. If you can farm successfully with minimal water, that's valuable knowledge." 5 months after receiving his worthless inheritance, Daniel harvested his first crop, not grapes, which would take more time, but the herbs he'd planted between the rows. The bundles of thyme, rosemary, and lavender weren't much, but when he took them to the farmer's market in town, they sold out within an hour, commanding premium prices from customers who appreciated their intense flavor and fragrance. "It's the stress," Daniel explained to a curious customer. "The dry, rocky conditions concentrate the essential oils in the plants, makes them more flavorful." The small success boosted his confidence. That evening, as he carefully counted his modest earnings, just enough to buy supplies for the next phase of planting, Daniel felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with money. He was creating something unique, something that worked with the land rather than against it. As he sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunset paint the terraced hillside in golden light, Daniel realized something important. His father had given him the worst land, but perhaps it was actually the perfect land for him, a blank canvas where he could try new approaches, without the pressure to follow tradition. The rocky hillside was teaching him to be a different kind of farmer than his father and brothers. Whether that would ultimately lead to success or failure remained to be seen. But for the first time since the land division, Daniel felt truly hopeful about the future. 6 months after inheriting the rocky hillside, Daniel stood at the edge of his property, watching the first light of dawn illuminate his work. The terrace is now wrapped around the entire hill like a giant staircase, each level planted with carefully tended grapevines and herb gardens. Stone walls reinforce the edges, constructed from the very rocks he had once cursed. Quite a view, isn't it? Pete said, joining him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Daniel nodded, accepting the cup gratefully. The chilly autumn morning made his fingers stiff. Sometimes I can't believe how much it's changed. Your mother would be proud, Pete said quietly. She always said this land had potential, even when your father wrote it off. The mention of his father made Daniel glance down at the main farmhouse where Thomas still lived. Smoke curled from the chimney, but otherwise the house was quiet. Their relationship remained strained, with Thomas rarely acknowledging Daniel's progress beyond the occasional grudging nod. Well, we've got a busy day ahead, Daniel said, changing the subject. The wine expert is coming at 10. Word of Daniel's hillside transformation had spread beyond the county. 3 weeks earlier, he'd received a surprising phone call from a wine consultant named William Parker, who worked with several prestigious vineyards in California. Parker had heard about Daniel's project from Giuseppe and wanted to see it firsthand. You really think he'll be interested? Pete asked skeptically. Your vines are still young. Giuseppe says he has a good eye for potential. He can look at young vines and the growing conditions and predict the quality of wine they'll eventually produce. As they walked back to the cabin, now expanded with a small office and proper bedroom, Daniel's phone rang. It was James, his oldest brother. Hey, I need to borrow your water tanks, James said without preamble. The irrigation pond is nearly dry and I've got winter wheat that needs moisture. Daniel sighed. It wasn't the first time his brothers had asked to borrow his equipment. Since the drought, his water collection system had proven its worth, and both James and Robert had gradually shifted from mocking his methods to reluctantly asking for help. I can't spare the tanks right now, Daniel replied, but I've got extra pipe. You could set up your own collection system on the east barn roof. It wouldn't be much, but it might help. James was silent for a moment. Fine. I'll send Ben over to pick up the pipe. The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Relations between the brothers had cooled since the land division, with James and Robert increasingly resentful of Daniel's growing success while they struggled with weather-related challenges. By mid-morning, Daniel had finished his daily inspection of the vines. Most were thriving, though a few showed signs of stress from the recent cold snap. He made notes in his journal, planning adjustments to their care. His mother's meticulous record-keeping had taught him the value of tracking every detail. A dust cloud in the distance signaled the arrival of William Parker's car. Daniel straightened his shirt and ran a hand through his hair, suddenly nervous. This visit could be a turning point for his fledgling. Vineyard Parker turned out to be younger than Daniel expected, probably in his early 40s, with an easy smile and knowledgeable eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Mr. Morgan, he said, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. I've been looking forward to this visit. Giuseppe speaks very highly of your project. Thank you for coming, Daniel replied. Though I should warn you, we're still in the early stages. The vines won't produce a proper harvest for at least another year. Parker nodded. I understand. I'm not here to taste wine, I'm here to assess potential. For the next 3 hours, they walked the terraced hillside, with Parker examining soil samples, testing the vines, and asking detailed questions about Daniel's methods. He seemed particularly interested in the water management system and the herb gardens planted between the vine rows. Intercropping herbs with vines is an ancient practice, Parker commented, rubbing a sprig of thyme between his fingers and inhaling its scent. It fell out of favor with modern mechanized vineyards, but there's growing evidence it improves soil health and may even enhance the flavor profile of the grapes. By lunchtime, they sat at the small table outside Daniel's cabin, sharing sandwiches Mrs. Hill had prepared. Parker's expression was thoughtful as he looked out over the hillside. I'll be direct with you, Mr. Morgan, he finally said. What you're creating here is remarkable. The combination of the rocky soil, elevation, and your water management system creates growing conditions similar to some of the finest vineyards in Europe. Daniel tried to temper his excitement. But the vines are still young. There's no guarantee they'll produce good wine. True. But I've been doing this long enough to recognize the markers of exceptional terroir. He pulled out a business card and handed it to Daniel. My company works with boutique wineries that focus on unique limited production wines. We're always looking for new growers with interesting stories and distinctive growing conditions. Daniel stared at the card. You want to work with me? Not immediately. Your vines need time, but I'd like to stay in touch. Visit again next spring and perhaps help guide your first real harvest. If the wine is as good as I suspect it might be, we could discuss a partnership. After Parker left, Daniel sat on his porch for a long time, his mind racing with possibilities. A partnership with Parker's company would mean not only a guaranteed buyer for his grapes, but also expert guidance in producing high-quality wine. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see his father's truck making its slow way up the hillside path. This was unexpected. Thomas rarely visited Daniel's property. Daniel walked down to meet him, curious and slightly wary. Thomas stepped out of the truck stiffly, his eyes scanning the terraced hillside. Who was that city fellow? He asked without greeting. Wine consultant, Daniel replied. He's interested in the vineyard, Thomas grunted. Herb's shipment came for you at the house. He gestured to several boxes in the truck bed. Figured I'd bring them up instead of making you come down. It was a small gesture, but from his father it felt significant. Daniel nodded his thanks as they unloaded the boxes. Seedlings for expanding his herb gardens ordered weeks ago and finally arrived. Place looks different, Thomas commented, surveying the terraces. Better than I expected. Coming from Thomas, this was high praise. Daniel felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It's getting there, he said cautiously. Still a lot of work ahead. Thomas nodded, his eyes lingering on the young grapevines. Your mother always wanted to plant grapes. I told her it was a waste of time. He cleared his throat. Maybe I was wrong about that. Before Daniel could respond, Thomas climbed back into his truck. Sunday dinner at the house. Your brothers will be there. You should come too. As his father's truck disappeared down the path, Daniel stood motionless, processing what had just happened. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest Thomas had come to acknowledging that Daniel's approach might have merit. The next day brought another surprise. A sleek car with a logo Daniel didn't recognize pulled up to his cabin. The driver introduced himself as the head chef from the Grand Oak, an upscale restaurant in the nearest city. I bought your herbs at the farmer's market last month, the chef explained. They were exceptional, much more flavorful than what my usual suppliers provide. I'd like to discuss a regular arrangement for my restaurant. By the end of their meeting, Daniel had his first commercial contract, a small but steady income from supplying fresh herbs to the Grand Oak twice weekly. The chef was particularly interested in the wild herbs that grew naturally on parts of the hillside, varieties that couldn't be found in conventional markets. These have a distinctive character, he said. Sampling a wild mountain thyme that Daniel had cultivated, my customers will appreciate the difference. As the chef was leaving, Robert's truck appeared, raising a cloud of dust as it climbed the hill. The brothers hadn't spoken in nearly 2 weeks, not since a heated argument about water usage. Robert nodded curtly at the departing chef. Another visitor? Restaurant owner, Daniel replied. He's buying herbs for his kitchen. Robert looked surprised. Must be paying well to drive all the way out here. Well enough, Daniel said, not wanting to boast. In truth, the herb contract alone would cover his basic expenses, allowing him to reinvest his farmer's market earnings into expanding the vineyard. I need your help, Robert said abruptly. There's a blight affecting my cattle's feed grass. The Agricultural Extension Office suggested trying some of those companion plants you've been growing. Says they might help control the spread. Daniel nodded. I can give you some seedlings and show you how to plant them. For the next hour, the brothers worked side by side, collecting plant starts and loading them into Robert's truck. The tension between them eased somewhat, as Daniel explained how different herbs could help manage pests and disease naturally. This is all the stuff Pa always called useless weeds. Robert commented as they finished. Daniel smiled. Sometimes the things people overlook turn out to be the most valuable. That Sunday, Daniel attended the family dinner at the main house for the first time in months. The conversation was stilted at first, with James and Robert discussing their challenges with the ongoing drought and early frost. The weather service says it might be the coldest winter in a decade, James reported grimly. My wheat fields aren't established enough to handle a deep freeze. The cattle feed costs are killing me, Robert added. If I can't find cheaper hay, I'll have to sell part of the herd. Thomas listened silently, his expression troubled. 6 months ago, his older sons had been thriving while Daniel struggled. Now the situation was shifting, with Daniel's operation better adapted to the challenging conditions. "What about you, Daniel?" Mrs. Hill asked, passing him a second helping of pot roast.
"How are things on the hillside?"
Daniel hesitated, not wanting to boast while his brothers were struggling. "Coming along. The herbs are selling well, and the vineyard consultant thinks the grapes have promise. He's got a contract with that fancy restaurant in the city," Robert interjected, "and some wine expert from California interested in his grapes." Thomas looked up sharply. "That true?" Daniel nodded, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "It's still small scale. The vineyard won't produce properly for another year at least. But you're making it work," Thomas said, his voice unusually quiet. On that rocky hillside everyone said was worthless. The table fell silent. Daniel met his father's gaze, seeing something there he hadn't seen in years. A flicker of respect, perhaps even pride. "I'm just getting started," Daniel replied. "There's a lot more to do." As he drove back to his cabin that night, Daniel reflected on how much had changed in 6 months. The land that had seemed like a punishment, a symbol of his father's lack of faith in him, had become an opportunity to prove himself in unexpected ways. The next morning, a light frost covered the hillside, making the terraces glitter in the early sunlight. Daniel walked among his vines, checking for damage, but they remained healthy, protected by their elevated position that allowed cold air to flow downhill. In the valley below, he could see James's workers scrambling to cover vulnerable crops. The same frost that barely touched his hillside was threatening the supposedly prime farmland. "Funny how things work out, isn't it?" Pete commented, joining him on his rounds. 6 months ago, everyone pitied you for getting this worthless land." Daniel nodded, watching as the sun slowly melted the frost, revealing the green vines and herbs beneath. The worst land turned out to be the best land, just for different reasons than anyone expected. 7 months after Thomas Morgan had divided his farm among his 3 sons, the countryside was transformed by an early blanket of snow. From the main farmhouse, the view had changed dramatically. The eastern valley, once the pride of the Morgan farm, lay dormant under the white cover, James's winter wheat struggling beneath the unexpected frost. The western pastures were equally still, Robert's cattle now mostly sold off or moved to rented barns for the winter. But the northern hillside, Daniel's worthless inheritance, was alive with activity. The terraces he'd built created natural barriers against the snow, and the stone walls radiated stored heat from the day's sunshine. Workers moved among the rows, preparing the grapevines for winter, while smoke rose from the new building near the top of the hill, a processing shed where Daniel dried herbs and prepared his increasingly popular products. Thomas stood at his living room window, coffee cup in hand, watching the distant figures on the hillside. The transformation over the past 7 months had been remarkable, but what happened in the last 4 weeks had changed everything. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Hill entered without waiting for a response, carrying a basket of fresh bread. "More visitors up at Daniel's place," she remarked, setting the basket on the kitchen counter. "Fancy car from the city." "Third one this week," Thomas nodded. "University people, most likely. Come to see his water system." The previous month, an unusually early winter storm had hit the county hard. While most farmers struggled with frozen pipes and damaged crops, Daniel's innovative water collection and distribution system had continued functioning, protected by its design and the hillside's natural features. The local newspaper had run a story about it, which caught the attention of the state university's agricultural department. "Not just the university," Mrs. Hill replied. "Heard it was someone from that organic grocery chain looking to set up a supply contract for his herbs." Before Thomas could respond, the phone rang. It was James calling from the bank in town. "Pa, I need to talk to you," James said, his voice tense. "The bank's questioning the loan renewal. With the crop damage from the early freeze, they're saying the East Fields didn't produce enough this year to justify the amount." "What did you tell them?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. The Eastern Valley, once considered the best part of the Morgan farm, had faced one challenge after another this year: drought, early frost, and now financing problems. "I told them we've always paid on time before," James replied. But they're talking about new agricultural risk assessments, climate pattern changes. They want more collateral. After promising to speak with the bank manager, an old friend, Thomas hung up and sighed heavily. The call from James wasn't unexpected. Robert had faced similar issues the previous week when he tried to secure financing for rebuilding his herd come spring. Thomas pulled on his coat and boots. He needed to clear his head, and a walk seemed the best way to do it. Almost without conscious decision, his feet took him toward the path leading up to Daniel's hillside. As he climbed, Thomas noted all the improvements, the widened path that now accommodated trucks and delivery vehicles, the clever drainage systems that prevented erosion during heavy rains, the stone walls built from the very rocks that had made the land seem worthless. Near the top, he paused to catch his breath. Despite having owned this land for decades, he'd rarely come up here, considering it too difficult to farm and therefore not worth his attention. Now, seeing it transformed, he wondered what other opportunities he might have missed over the years by being too set in his ways. The visitor's car was parked near Daniel's cabin, which itself had been expanded into a modest but comfortable home. Thomas recognized the logo on the vehicle, an upscale grocery chain with stores throughout the state. As he approached, he could hear Daniel talking with a woman in a business suit. "We can start with the herb products immediately," she was saying, "particularly the dried blends and infused oils. As for the wine, once it's in production, we'd like exclusive rights to the first vintage for our premium store locations." Daniel nodded, looking both pleased and slightly overwhelmed. He spotted his father and excused himself from the conversation. "Pa," he said, clearly surprised. "Is everything okay?" Thomas gestured toward the visitor. "Didn't mean to interrupt your business. It's fine. We were just wrapping up." Daniel studied his father's face. "Something wrong down at the main farm?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded slightly. James called from the bank, having some trouble with his loan renewal. Daniel's expression showed concern but not surprise. The challenges his brothers faced weren't secrets in the family anymore. "Let me finish up here," he said. "Then maybe we could talk." Thomas waited, watching as his youngest son confidently concluded his business meeting. The nervous, uncertain young man from 7 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who clearly knew his worth and the value of what he'd created. As the visitor drove away, Thomas and Daniel walked to the edge of the highest terrace, looking out over the snow-covered valley. "Your brothers are struggling," Thomas finally said. "The bank's questioning the value of their operations after all the weather problems this year." Daniel nodded. "I heard. Robert mentioned it at Sunday dinner. Meanwhile, you've got grocery chains and universities knocking at your door." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Quite a turnaround from when I gave you this rocky hillside." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't about the land, Pa. It was about finding the right approach for the conditions." "No," Thomas said firmly. "It was about you. You saw possibilities where I only saw problems." He turned to face his son directly. "I was wrong, Daniel. Wrong to think this land was worthless, and wrong to think you deserved less than your brothers." The admission hung in the cold air between them. For years, Thomas had favored his older sons, seeing in them reflections of himself and his traditional ways. Daniel, with his new ideas and willingness to question established practices, had always been the outsider. "I gave you the worst land because I didn't believe in you," Thomas continued, the words clearly difficult for him, "and you turned it into something better than anyone could have imagined." Daniel looked away, uncomfortable with his father's rare display of emotion. "I had help. Pete, Mrs. Hill, Giuseppe, the extension office. But you were the one who asked for help," Thomas interrupted. "The one who was willing to learn and try new things. Your brothers and we just kept doing what we've always done, even when it stopped working so well." They stood in silence for a while, watching as Daniel's workers covered the younger vines with protective cloth against the deepening cold. "What will James and Robert do?" Daniel finally asked. Thomas sighed. "I don't know. The bank's being cautious after all the weather problems. Can't say I blame them." Daniel seemed to be considering something. "I've been thinking about expanding," he said slowly. "The vineyard consultant believes we could develop the lower sections of the hillside too. Create a larger operation. You've got enough on your plate already." "Surely," Thomas replied. "Maybe. Or maybe it's time to think differently about the whole Morgan farm." Daniel turned to his father. What if we integrated our operations instead of keeping them separate? James and Robert have equipment and experience I could use, and my water management system could be expanded to help their fields. Thomas looked skeptical. Your brothers might not be open to new approaches. They might if they understood it's not about replacing traditional farming, but adapting it. Daniel gestured toward the valley. The climate's changing, Pa. What worked in your day and your father's day might need adjustments now. But that doesn't mean throwing out everything you taught us. The idea took root in Thomas's mind. A partnership between his sons combining Daniel's innovation with his brother's resources and experience might be exactly what the Morgan farm needed to thrive in changing times. Would you be willing to talk to them about it? Thomas asked. Share what you've learned up here? Daniel nodded. Of course. We're still family, even with all that's happened. As they walked back toward Daniel's cabin, Thomas found himself seeing his youngest son clearly, perhaps for the first time. The boy he had underestimated had become a man with vision and determination, someone who found opportunity where others saw only obstacles. You remind me of your mother, Thomas said quietly. She always looked at problems differently too. I should have remembered that. 2 days later, the Morgan family gathered around the dining table in the main farmhouse. The atmosphere was tense as Daniel outlined his proposal for integrating their separate operations into a more resilient whole. The Eastern Valley is still ideal for certain crops, he explained, but we could modify the irrigation system using what I've learned on the hillside, and Robert's pastures could benefit from rotating the cattle through different areas, planting some of these drought-resistant grasses I've been testing. James and Robert exchanged skeptical glances, but they listened. Their recent struggles had opened them to possibilities they might have dismissed before. And what do you get out of this? James finally asked. Access to equipment I can't afford on my own, help with labor during busy seasons, and a bigger family operation that benefits all of us. Daniel spread a map on the table. Each of our sections has strengths and weaknesses. Together they could be something special. The discussion continued late into the evening, with Thomas mostly listening as his sons debated approaches and possibilities. There were disagreements, certainly, but also moments of genuine collaboration as they began to see how their separate experiences might complement each other. As Mrs. Hill served coffee and apple pie, Thomas cleared his throat. The room fell silent. 7 months ago, I divided this farm thinking I was being fair, he said. I gave what I thought was the best land to those I thought deserved it most. He looked at Daniel. I was wrong. The land I considered worthless has proven to be valuable beyond anyone's expectations, because the right person saw its potential. He looked around at his 3 sons. The Morgan farm has always been about family, about building something that lasts. Maybe it's time we remembered that. The next morning, as dawn broke over the snow-covered farm, Thomas stood again at his window. In the distance, he could see Daniel's truck making its way down from the hillside, followed by James's pickup coming from the Eastern Valley. They were meeting Robert at the old barn to continue their discussion about the farm's future. Thomas smiled slightly. 7 months ago, his decision to give his youngest son the worst land had been meant as a lesson, and a lesson had indeed been learned, but not the one he'd intended. Instead, Daniel had taught them all to see beyond the surface, to find value where no one else was looking. The worthless rocky hillside had become the most promising part of the Morgan farm, and Thomas's greatest regret had transformed into unexpected pride in his youngest son's vision and perseverance.